So for the rest of the questions, it says, for the following, is the stated conclusion reasonable? Why or why not? A study found a positive relationship between the happiness of elderly people and the number of pets they have. Therefore, having more pets causes elderly people to be happier. So the real problem word here is causes. We've observed that there's a relationship between people being happy and having pets. But if we don't do a controlled experiment, for example, taking a group of elderly people, randomly assigning them to two groups, giving the one group pets and the other group not pets, that would be the way we could prove causation. Okay, but causation cannot be found in this way. So I'm going to write no, causation can only be found with a controlled experiment. Just to talk about that a little more, because sometimes it feels like, no, I feel like, it's okay, I can say that there's causation. Maybe people with more motivation who are already more happy have the motivation to go out and buy a pet, the energy to do that type of stuff, so it's really hard to prove causation unless we start out with that experimental setup. Exercise 4. A researcher wanted to find out whether higher levels of a certain drug given to experimental rats would decrease the time it took them to complete a given maze to find food. Why would the researcher have to carry out an experiment rather than an observational study? So piggybacking off the last question, that's to prove causation. Okay, so we need that experimental study to prove causation. So now we are going to describe an experiment that the researcher might carry out based on 30 comparable rats and 3 dosage levels. So the first thing we would want to do with the 30 rats is randomly assign the rats to 3 groups. Typically equal groups, like of 10, that's not required. So then our 3 groups would be, 1 is 0 milligrams, and we could say that's our control group. And then in this case, we have 2 experimental groups. We have the 1 milligram group and the 2 milligram group. So we're also kind of seeing dosage levels here. So we're, seeing does it help, but also does the dosage level make a difference? So the next thing we're going to do is give each group their amount of the drug. And then our last step was to find an average time for each group. And compare. Now I'm just going to write compare the groups because there's a whole lot that goes into something called statistical significance. Like if the groups are different, was it a big enough difference to say that, yeah, the drug made a difference? And that's something we'll get into at the end of the unit, but that's our basic steps for doing that. The last part, it says use the following scenarios for problems A through C. I'm not going to read through each one. I'm actually just going to kind of do these just to save the time and make the video a little shorter. So we're deciding which one's a controlled experiment, which scenario describes a survey, and then we have some follow-up questions, and which is an observational study. So I'm going to read A and decide which of those 3, and then I'll answer the second follow-up question. Researchers want to determine if there is a relationship between whether or not a woman smoked during pregnancy and the birth weight of her baby. Researchers examined records for the past 5 years at a large hospital. So that's an observational study, okay? So we are basically like looking at the records, deciding what happened based on that. So this one we're gonna go down here, and that's situation A. Why have they not performed experiments to find a causal relationship in this situation? Basically, one of the reasons we don't do experiments is ethics. So we probably wouldn't take an experiment and have 10 people smoke while they were pregnant and not smoke if we think that there's a chance it could harm the baby. So this is Part 2 is for ethical reasons. Okay, so let's read scenario B. A large high school wants to know the proportion of students who currently use illegal drugs. Uniformed police officers asked a random sample of 200 students about their drug use. So this one is a survey. Okay, it sounds, I don't know how they asked them, whether it was paper or in person, but we're going to say this is C. Will the results of the survey be accurate? Why or why not? Well, if you have a police officer asking people about their drug use directly, people might not be honest. Okay, so basically, will the results of the survey be accurate? I'm going to write probably not first. And then the students may not be honest. So our last one, a company develops a new dog food. The company wants to know if dogs would prefer its new food over the competition's food. 100 dogs who were food deprived overnight were given equal amounts of the two dog foods. The new food versus the competitor's food. The proportion of dogs preferring the new food was recorded. Okay, so this is somewhat of a controlled experiment. The reason it's not really a controlled experiment, though, is because the dogs weren't split into the two groups randomly. Okay, so we're missing random assignment, but it does sound like a controlled, oops, this sounds like B. Okay, and there's no random assignment of the dogs. Okay, so that's an important part of a controlled experiment, and it is missing.